Assalamu alaikum and good evening, good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I'm currently sitting in Istanbul, so we have a difference of time in that sense. One of the things I want to stress, first of all, is thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss some of my ideas and thoughts. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A section, because for me as an academic, one of the things I learned, I took my training from Western academia, that is true, but being raised and born as a Muslim and being influenced by people in the seminaries within the Muslim environment, going to madrasa as a young kid, being surrounded by members of the ulama throughout the Muslim world whenever I've traveled there, sort of shaped me in terms of how I wanted to do history. And I remember saying by Imam Shafi'i, who said, whenever he got into a debate, if he won the debate, he was happy because he spoke the truth. And when he lost the debate, he was happy because he learned the truth. And in that sense, there is something which is quite important about the need to try to attain, to be a truth seeker. And I think that was important for me when I went into academia, which is to try to determine and establish some forms of truth. Now, the challenge with that is that sometimes it's really difficult to attain the truth because you are dependent on information. The more information you have, the more rounded your opinion is. The less information you have, you are restricted to form an opinion. Nonetheless, we academics continue to form opinion. So at times, while I am attempting to attain the truth, it's not always possible. And so what I say is, okay, if you can't always attain the truth, you can at least know what is not the truth to that degree. And so we can sometimes deconstruct the falsehoods in that sense. Now, what I noticed regarding Muslims in particular, being a Muslim myself, is that when I studied Ottoman history in particular, I was the only Muslim, non-Turk Muslim, who was studying Ottoman history for my master's. I did the master's in Middle Eastern Studies with an emphasis on Turkish politics and Ottoman history, and I was the only person in the class. 5 years later, when I did my PhD, I was still the only one, and that really surprised me. It caught me off. And what was interesting is people used to joke at SOAS that Yaqub is the Muslim Ottoman historian. I remember doing a interview on a radio station in East London. It was a Bengali radio station, to be honest. And one of the callers called in and said, why don't you study about India or Pakistan? Why are you doing Ottoman history? And I found that an interesting question, which is that we have framed ourselves in terms of our memories still within the colonial framework, which is we assume that we should only study things in relation to what our closest remit is. And yet when I was studying with my fellows at SOAS, people studied everything. And so I always say, like, I want to see Muslims studying French Revolution. Just study whatever you want to study. I mean, we need to encourage a mindset of trying to attain as much knowledge as possible. What I also learned at my time at SOAS and Western academia was that Western academics in particular did not hesitate to write about Islamic history and spoke with a form of confidence, which came from a sense of colonial confidence, because a lot of the narratives are Eurocentric and Orientalist positions. And what I noticed about Muslim students in particular, because they had a disconnect regarding their own history, although they felt uncomfortable what was being told to them, nonetheless, they had no ability to be able to counter that. And I found that interesting. There was a distrust in terms of what they were learning. So that was clear, but they had no alternative to say, you know what, but this is what I think happened. And so it was clear that there was a form of, they were disadvantaged. What I did learn in Western academia, however, was that academia in the West predominantly was designed, regarding humanities, was designed to create intellectuals. Intellectuals are designed to cultivate societies, think, critique societies, critique history, critique memory, and try to fashion what you could call societies and civility and communities in a way where they can have a more rounded and better understanding. That was important. Now, Muslims, to some degree, had that. The ulama are supposed to reflect that, but nonetheless, there is still a disconnect somewhere where even in the seminaries, the idea of studying Islamic history is very superficial. And when Islamic history is taught, it's taught with the interest of given a Friday sermon simply to rally the emotion of the worshippers, but doesn't give them any more serious content than that. And so for me, and we spoke about this earlier, the younger generation in particular, who are becoming far more technologically savvy, far more connected to information. There's a sense of democratization because of the internet regarding information, that they are asking totally different questions. The concern I have with social media, and I've said this consistently, is that there's only so much Islam you can learn from TikTok. Fundamentally, you still need focused writing, you need focused thinkers, you need thinkers who are ingrained and integrated within their communities. They are invested in their communities as people. They want to raise the level of thinking within their communities, and they understand and live in accordance to a shared experience. And that was necessary. So while social media to some degree has given many opportunities, to some degree it's created a screen in a physical sense and in a metaphorical sense between the agents who are teaching and the ones who are learning. For me, the concern I have by and large by the new Muslim generation is that there is a humongous consumption culture, of which knowledge has also become part of that consumption culture. When knowledge is consumed, but production is very little, and that's not helpful. And so I've given a host of talks where, you know, and I speak to my fellow academics and Muslim scholars and so forth, and we're just exhausted and drained because we're going from one talk to another where people are consuming this information. And what we're trying to do is encourage them to start producing this information, to be reciprocal agents in the production process in that sense. No scholar, thinker, or individual is a scholar just based on their own volition. It's an interaction with the ones that help them, the ones that they talk to, the ideas that go backwards and forwards. We are in some ways layers upon layers upon layers of all those people that have invested in us. And then that's reflective of our work, right? And so this is one of the things that I'm concerned about in terms of the younger generation. And so this is why I now take history more seriously. When I first started Ottoman history in a strange way, it was just interesting for me. It was fun. But by the time I finished my PhD, I realized that this was ideological, this was political, and this is a serious endeavor in the way that it shapes memory. And the shaping of memory shapes identity. And so to understand who you are, you need to understand who you were. To understand who you were, it's better for me that the voices are indigenous, that you have control over that, you have agency, you have a level of power in which you can talk for yourself. And that's lacking, I felt, you know, and I still find that lacking, which is surprising because the sort of repository that we have of 1400 years of Islamic history, which is a huge treasure chest in that sense, which created scholar after scholar after scholar, both male and female, from across the world. We're not replicating that now in the 21st century to some degree. And the question is why? Now, I can give you one of the reasons why. I am from the Asian subcontinent. My mom's from Pakistan and my dad's from Uganda. And when I started my PhD in Ottoman history, my mom was frustrated. She said, who's going to pay you to think? What are you doing? Do a STEM subject. Or who's going to pay you to think? And, you know, it sounded like a very off-the-cuff statement, but it was quite profound in many ways. My mom's a simple lady. She's a single mother working in a factory. When I finished my PhD, I remember going back to my mom and I got my job at Istanbul University. I said, Mom, I'm getting paid to think. And she went, what are you talking about? She forgot the conversation, but I remembered it because it touched the nerve in the sense of, I felt this throughout my time as a Muslim doing history in that sense, which is the idea that thinking is a luxury, thinking is a privilege, and that's in the hands of the privileged few. And here I am as somebody from a working class background who was living in South London. My parents live in Tooting, and I dared to do history. I funded it myself. I worked, and I came out as a thinker. And I still suffered from this sense of imposter syndrome because I was always nervous. Are these people really taking notes on what I'm saying? Is this really happening? I'm the guy from South London. This shouldn't be happening. But what you start to realize is that knowledge in particular, and in Islam, the culture of attaining wisdom, because that's what we're seeking. We're seeking to be wisdom, people who give wisdom. I think that's what's lost in Western academia. There's no attempt to give wisdom. There's only an attempt to give knowledge and information, and most of the time just pure data. And we are driven as people to try to give wisdom. And wisdom is the idea of trying to cultivate people, cultivate society, cultivate communities. And that's central in accordance with the Islamic ethos. And so I thought to myself, why is this lacking? What's gone wrong here? And can we as historians add something to the table? Throughout my time, and Naeem and I, he sent me a message before where I had given a talk at another like Muslim seminary, like a madrasa in High Wycombe, in which, and it resonated with one of the questions a woman had asked me about her children. She said, I want my kids to learn Islamic history, we just don't have options. I want my kids to know Ottoman history, but we don't have any historians. I want my kids to know about history of the Asian subcontinent. We have no historians. What's going on? We teach them Quran, we teach them Hadith, we teach them how to be good people, but the history is missing. And can you do this for us? And I was like, this is not a one-man venture. This is a collective venture. What we need to do at this moment in time is convince our communities that the STEM subjects are important. Of course they are. But we also need people who are going to think on our behalf, defend our interests, and speak in a way where they can talk about history in that sense. And so before I start, I'm really sorry I gave you this little lecture in that sense, this little caveat, but I just wanted to help you guys understand what motivated me. So I start off with the idea, can we learn history from an Islamic perspective? This is one of the things that I've always raised the questions, especially regarding Islamic history. Is that possible in many ways? My opinion is it is possible. So the first thing I want to do is explain some of the learning outcomes of today, what we're going to do. So one of the first point is why is learning history important? Well, I think I've just explained that to you, which is that in today's generation, in the 19th century, what I found interesting is when the photograph first came into being, photographs were being used as a form of documentation, and they were being used as a way of constructing memory. And photographs were seen as a form of presenting fact. This is a picture, this is what happened. This is a picture of this is what's happening. And we forget that every photograph is a construction. In those days, a guy would come with a huge machine and make you pose and they'd pull it, and then you'd have someone go and print it out. But photographs were designed as a way of constructing memory. Outside the frame of the picture, there's a lot more that's going on that's missing. In that sense, we learn very quickly that photographs are political. It's not only what's in the photo, there's also what's important is what's not in the photo, right? Not only that, when you put text next to a photo, it shapes the way you think about that picture. If we omit text from the photo, we're then also shaping the way you think by not giving you information. In that sense, you start to learn very quickly that photographs are political. The point I'm making is, whereas in the past, photographs were used to construct memory, today with the social media tools, photographs are used to blur memory. You see so many photos on Instagram that you can't remember the last one that you saw. Next slide, next slide, next slide. It's bombarding the memory in such a way that it doesn't allow one to understand and remember the past. In that sense, what it's doing is it's creating a sort of myopic understanding of how the human being sees themselves in the world they're in right now. They're continuously obsessed of a continued present, and they're unable to see the future or imagine the future, as I say, and they have no recollection of the past. And this is problematic to me. And so in that sense, I felt learning history was important. When we talk about the current Palestinian issue, I gave a talk last week on the Palestinian issue, and that a lot of the speakers start from 48. And I said, as an Ottoman historian, I mean, there's Sykes and Picot, there's the Balfour Declaration, and there's the Zionist intervention in 1840. I mean, this stretches back further. In some ways, when you look at the Palestinian flag was created by Sykes. It's a flag of the colonial powers. When we look at the Syrian conflict, the current Syrian flag that exists is a response to the so-called revolutionary flag, which was part of the French Mandate. What it indicates is that even the activities and the struggles that exist today have been shaped within the memory of the nation state. And yet these regions had memories prior to the nation state. And that's important because what you start to learn is the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic empire, was a multi-religious empire, it was a multilingual empire, it straddled 3 continents, and in the 19th century at least, it was the only Muslim empire that was independent from colonialism. There was a form of colonial intervention, but the Ottomans were not colonized. And one of the things it's important to understand when one is studying the history of colonialism is that the Ottomans were neither colonizers nor were they colonized. And that's important to understand that because a lot of times the language we use when we speak of the Ottomans, we use it from the framework of the historiography of the nation state or the historiography of the colonizers who tried to place the Ottomans within their linguistic framework. And that's not helpful. The Ottomans, in that sense, it might sound strange, but while people critique exclusivity, to some degree, exclusivity is important because it gives you your identity as being independent, right? In that sense, this is why this is necessary in that sense. So this is why learning history is important because you place yourself in the timeline of humanity and where you are. In that sense, having a connection to the past gives you an indication of who you are right now and who you ought to be. I've always said, and I've learned this as an Ottoman historian and Islamic history, is that Muslims are being told who they are, Muslims are being told who they ought to be, and Muslims are told who they were. And they're not being told by themselves, they're being told by foreign entities in that sense. And that's where power matters. And that's where history is important. Because once you understand who you were, you then understand who you are, and then you can make the imagination of who you want to be. In that sense, it's important that Muslims are in control of this narrative, which I'll talk about later, in regards to understanding the importance of Islamic history, right? The other thing that I know is that history has become, especially Ottoman history, was a Western enterprise. One of the things that we notice is the collapse of the Ottomans. You see, SOAS was an example of this, of which I am a student of. SOAS was created in 1924, the same year of the abolishment of the Caliphate. And the idea of SOAS was, it was related to British foreign policy in some degree, of understanding the region better and having experts who can understand the region better so that they can be skilled in helping the British in whatever activities the British wanted to execute. Over the years, obviously that changed. More students from more indigenous backgrounds came to SOAS, became students. They challenged their professors, they challenged their lecturers, and in some ways they put out a discourse where SOAS evolved over time and became a very unique enterprise in that sense, right? But what we learn in that sense is that you can go to most Western universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Oxford, SOAS, and they have Ottoman Studies Department. They don't have the same equivalent of the Abbasids or the Umayyads. In that sense, Ottoman history is a Western enterprise to some degree that we don't find in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. The only other country that invests in the same weight regarding Ottoman history is Turkey. And Turkey is an exception because Turkey sees itself as the successor state of the Ottomans. So it's important to understand then that why have Muslims abandoned the learning of Ottoman history, especially 600 years of Ottoman history in that sense, right? And especially when you see that during the collapse of the Ottomans in particular, Istanbul was the center of the Muslim world. All right, which people forget. It was literally the center of the Muslim world in that sense. And when the Ottoman state was collapsing, you see the emergence of the Caliphate Committee in the Asian subcontinent who are resonating with what's happening in Istanbul. So in that sense, it's important to understand is why has that memory disappeared? Why has the imagination disappeared? What happened for that to just go? And so I used the word collective amnesia. And so I have a friend who's a psychologist, and she said to me, how can we have collective amnesia? Amnesia is down to the individual. How can it be collective? And I try to explain to her that we have collective memory, we have collective trauma, and we can have collective amnesia. And the way we have collective amnesia in the sense is that when you come to Istanbul, you'll see Ottoman mosques, Ottoman buildings. When you read books, you'll have some sort of like understanding of the Ottoman past, but it's like Dutch cheese. There's a lot of holes in it. Why do those holes exist? Because we haven't passed down the history from one generation to another in that sense. And it's created what I've called this collective amnesia across the Muslim world. What's interesting is because of Dirilish Ertuğrul, the TV series, which as a historian I'm quite critical of, but I understand it as a TV show. It's created a sense of vigor again, that people want to know, okay, whoa, what happened in regards to that past? So they want to learn more, right? And in that sense, you start to see, I explained to someone that when I was young, and I'm sure many of you would know this, I was interested in The Sword of Tipu Sultan, which was a show on Channel 4. And that was the first time that I had seen a TV show where Muslims were the protagonists and Tipu was that protagonist. And even for Hindus, you had the Mahabharata, which became this huge, humongous epic that they were showing on Channel 4. We start to realize that popular culture to some degree has an ability to cultivate ideas and so forth. The problem with popular culture is that it has no interest in speaking truth. However, the interesting thing is sometimes you can speak more truth in fiction than you can in reality. So I'm not dismissive of popular culture in that sense. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today is when it comes to writing Ottoman history in particular, is there a way of writing it from the perspective of Islam? And I believe there is in that sense. Not simply I'm not trying to, once again, swing the pendulum the other way to the point of romanticizing Islamic history. I think we need to understand when Muslims made mistakes, when Muslims did things that were unacceptable in accordance to the framework of Islam. And we can be upset about particular things that happened in the past. These are human beings. And that's why I want to make a distinction between what is Islamic history, which is the corpus of Islam, and what Muslims did. And sometimes I give this example. Imagine you have a painting. What Muslims tend to do is they want to focus on the brushstroke. Why did Muslims do this? Why did Muslims do that? And I asked them to take a step back and just look at the painting as a whole. And once you understand the painting as a whole, the Islamic corpus as a whole, you start to understand the importance of what people are doing a lot better. And so we get focused on little things because we are using today's morality to judge the past to some degree. And I think that's not helpful for us to some degree. Muslims always ask me the questions, what if the Ottomans did this? What if the Ottomans did that? I said, it doesn't matter. We can only go on what they did. If the Ottomans did this, the British might have done that. If the Ottomans did that, then the Russians might have done this. Who knows? But what we know is what they did. And so what can we take from that? And it's not only the mistakes they made, it's what did they do which was positive. In my PhD, for example, the Ottomans were a constitutional caliphate, which surprises people. How is that even possible? A constitutional caliphate with a parliamentary system, is that even possible? That's not even part of people's imagination. And yet that happened. So for me, this is why I want to talk about that. Okay, so is history simply a study of the past? Well, not really. In many ways, everything is the study of the past. In that sense, everything is history because all knowledge is from the past. And we build upon layers. As a Muslim, I always make the point, and I teach my students because I teach in the theology department, that Allah Ta'ala, we say, taught Adam alayhi salam, the names of things, which means that Allah taught Adam, the first man, the names of things, and then he built upon that. What we learn from this view then, and the idea we learn from this, is that knowledge is learned upon building upon knowledge that came before. It doesn't come from a vacuum. And so when I listen to many Islamic thinkers these days talking about constitutionalism, justice, shura, ethics, there's an assumption that these ideas are coming from a vacuum. But when I go back into history, people have said it before. And this is what I mean by this collective amnesia, which is that the residue of the idea is still manifested in the community. The community just doesn't know where it's from. And so they assume it's emerged from their minds because they can't find the books. But Muslim tradition is an oral tradition in many ways. And so we pass things down without knowing, including our food. I mean, I always say, like, when you look at even food in Muslim societies, the imprint of Islam is in the food as well. And food history is really important to understanding what people did in that sense. So what I realize is that the learning of history then is an intellectual enterprise. Of course, it's an intellectual enterprise. Like I said, we take meaning from the past. It provides people an identity. They can draw from the repository of their culture. It's an attempt to learn the truth. And all knowledge is from the past. Hence, all knowledge is historical. Okay, in that sense. All right, if you guys are getting bored, you can just let me know. But hopefully you're not. All right, next one. So as I said, it's a Western enterprise, but the one that I wanted to focus on was the 3 key challenges that I found in Western academia. One of the interesting things about Western academia, putting aside the ideological, is as a Muslim, what I found is that it was devoid of a particular form of knowledge in epistemology. What that meant is that Western academia was secular from its inception. It rejected Allah. It rejected the idea that Allah created insan. It rejected the soul. It rejected that human beings had the soul. It rejected the idea of the nafs. And in that sense, human beings are driven by these instincts and desires. And so what it did is it reduced the individual to something which was purely material. And that was manifest even in the knowledge production. And in that sense, I still remember, and I joke with my students, is I remember one time I said, Allah says in the Quran, and somebody in the audience says, you can't say that. And I said, oh, well, what am I supposed to say? They said, that's not objective. You have to say the Quran says. And I remember that statement because I stood there for a few seconds just perplexed. And then I don't know what happened because I was so frustrated. I said, well, who wrote the book? Every book has an author. Who wrote the book? And I remember my colleague looking at me going, what's going on here? Why has he lost it? And the reason why I lost it is because I felt like something was stripped away from me. My relationship with the Quran was taken away from me. I was being told that this book that you read, you don't understand how to read it. Or the way that you read it, it has no meaning for us here. The way that you read it, you keep that in your home. But when you're here, you do it the way we say. And for me, that was, to find a better word, it was intellectually violent, exceptionally violent to me in terms of it really, it affected me in that sense. I gave them what they wanted in the sense of say, fine, the Quran says in chapter such and such, blah, 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 blah. But I went home frustrated and saying, okay, we have a situation here. What we realize is the language in which the framework is built is that will it ever give Muslims a fair chance to write about Islamic history from their perspective? Will it give Muslims a fair chance to speak of Islamic history from their language? If it detaches and ruptures the language, the emotion, the sentiment, and just the framework of Islam in the way it's written, you can't be surprised that young Muslim kids can't resonate with it. On the one hand, the mosque and the knowledge that you're taught in the madrasa feels very different than the knowledge that's been taught in Western academia. There's two different knowledge bases. And so, you know, young kids, what I say is that the problem with me growing up in the West is Islam wasn't learned from osmosis. Now, I was fortunate. I was a particular generation where there was osmosis in my house. My parents had come from Muslim countries, and so they were trying to give Islam to us. It was in the fabric of everything they said, everything they did. They took us back to Pakistan so that we smelt it, we breathed it, we could see it in people's conversations. It was in the language. Even to this day, when I'm praying to Allah, I don't pray in English for some strange reason. I pray in my mother tongue because it just feels more natural to connect in that way. In that sense, osmosis was important. What I realized for my young students in the West, Islam wasn't osmosis. Islam was something they learned when they went to the mosque. Islam was something which was taught to them by an imam. Islam was something that they were constantly defending from the Western press, media, and even in academia. So in that sense, as an academic, I was asking myself, how can we make the writing of Islam in a way that was, that resonated with them, where they can connect with it? And as a Muslim, I've made this case that when we read the Quran, and I make this argument that the first word of the Quran, when Jibreel alayhi salam, the messenger of messengers, come to Rasulullah, the Prophet, he says to him, Iqra. And Naeem and I, we spoke about this before, and I like telling this story because the narrative in the cave is often reduced, and I try to open it up. So when he's saying to the Prophet, Iqra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq, what my students often say, I say, what does the word Iqra mean? And they say, it means to read. It means to read. Iqra means to read. And I asked them, I said, are you sure it means to read? And of course it does. I said, did the angel Gabriel get a piece of chalk and wrote on the wall the verse? What was the Prophet reading? There was nothing to read. And I said, oh, okay, he wasn't reading. He was told to recite. Iqra means to recite. And so the Prophet was asked to recite. Okay, then I say to my students, if he was asked to recite, well, recitation is easy. Most of us have been to madrasa. I lived in Syria and I knew students who couldn't speak English, but were singing with Lionel Richie. They heard it once. Hello, is it me you're looking for? Hello? They could recite it upon listening. It was pretty straightforward. So is the Prophet saying, I can't recite this? Is that what he's saying? I can't recite? Of course he can recite it. It wasn't even the whole surah. So what was being asked from him? He was basically making the excuse that I'm illiterate because he was listening to miracle. And so he was saying, I don't understand. What he was saying is, I don't get what you're telling me. Like, this is beyond me, because he'd never heard anything like that. And Iqra means also to understand. So what I find fascinating is the first word of the Quran, of which the Quran takes its name from. Quran, qara'a, takes its name from Iqra. It means to read, recite, understand. That's a basic Quranic principle. In that sense, the Quran is a book you read, the Quran is a book you recite, and the Quran is a book you understand. The first word is telling you your relationship with the book. What I take from that then is that's how every thinker, Muslim thinker and intellectual should be. They should be people who are well read. They are people who should recite and speak, and they are people who should understand. That is a fundamental principle of the Quran. The next part of the story is interesting as well, which I haven't often told people. So what is Allah Ta'ala telling Rasul Sallallahu? He's saying, Iqra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq, Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram, allazi allama bil kalam. He's telling the messenger of Allah that I created mankind. Remember that. Have you forgotten who created mankind? It's me, Allah, who created mankind. He's reminding him. He's given him a history lesson. He's reminding him, but not only him, he's reminding the rest of us. Don't you dare, any of you, forget why you're here. It was me who created you, and it was me who taught you with the pen. Have you forgotten? In that sense, you take a fundamental lesson here, which is the importance for mankind in Islam, is to know what their purpose is. And it's also to know that they are agents of learning. They are agents of the pen. They are agents of teaching. In that sense, for me, that verse becomes very important in the way that I learn history. I then went back to SOAS, dust myself down and said, okay, I'm a Muslim. How am I going to do my history now? Now, one of the other interesting things about the Quran is an emotional book. People find academics very boring. We are boring people in that way. But the Quran is a book, like if you read the Surah Yusuf, it's beautiful in the way that the prose go. Or Surah Tawbah, in which Allah Ta'ala is warning us without even the basmala. And so you start to realize that Allah uses emotion in the book as a way of cultivating you. He draws imaginations in your mind by telling you that heaven looks like this and hell looks like that. And he creates these pictures in your head by words alone, in that sense. What's interesting then is that during the Battle of Badr, when the Muslims were victorious, the verse in the Quran comes that to remind them not to get arrogant. And then in the Battle of Uhud, when the Muslims lose, and the people who came down from the mountain who were not supposed to, Allah says to them, I know you felt a sense of remorse, and I forgive you. In that sense, you can see that Allah isn't telling us how to interact with human beings. So one of the things I learned then was, how can I write in a style which was also Quranic, in the sense of connecting with the reader? And I think the best works of history are not only historically accurate, are not only tight in regards to the way we write, but they're also significant in the way we tell the message. And that's why fiction works. And that's, I think, something that we should take in that sense. So that was important to me. Now, the three things I said, which were important then, were ideology, narrative, language, okay? And ideology shapes a particular worldview. And when we write, nobody writes from a vacuum. When you are born, you're innocent, but then you're born into a worldview. And then you're continuously shaped by the knowledge, the environment, the culture, the traditions, in that sense. And as I said, osmosis, you're being shaped by that ideology. And so when historians are writing, they're writing from usually a ideological paradigm. In that sense, as a Muslim writer, I had to be aware that Orientalism, secularism, Eurocentric ideas were all fundamentally frameworks in which Islamic history was being written. How do we emancipate ourselves from that? How do you, on the one hand, recognize that? And so that's why it needed academics to go into that and say, okay, this is a problem, but then how can we provide an alternative? One of the ways we could do it is we could write within the Western academic framework, and that Muslim students would have to be smart enough to understand the nuance in the way that we were writing. But what I learned is that Muslim scholars in the past, they were Muslims who wrote for Muslims. So in that sense, another way we could write is we could write purely for a Muslim audience. We can take that into consideration, say this is our base, and we can write in this way. And so as an academic, I myself, and this is why I'm interested in the Q&A, I'm at the moment straddling these two sides, okay, using two, what I say, frameworks as a way of writing, one for a purely Muslim audience, and then one for a general audience, from which Muslims can take meaning. The second one is narrative, and narrative is far more dangerous than ideology in many ways, because narrative is a particular it's a particular form of storytelling, and as you know, stereotypes, they stick. And so what happens is, and you know, when we started off before, the Ottoman decline narrative, the paradigm is there, the Ottomans declined, and that narrative has stuck. And then someone like myself as an Ottoman historian, we look at it and say, okay, there's some problems here. We need to deconstruct this. And did the Ottomans decline? Is this what happened? But narratives stick. Narratives of Muslims being terrorists stick. Islamism sticks. Muslims being barbarians stick. I still remember Brexit. The idea of Brexit when Farage had those posters, the Turks are coming. It evokes a particular memory. What's interesting with that poster regarding the Turks are coming is the idea that there's something in the collective European memory of the Turk. The Turk is who? Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, he's not going to get up from his grave and come running along. But the idea that that can be used as a form of language, that the Turks are coming and that people could resonate with it, and they didn't know why. It shows how from osmosis, there's a collective memory. What's interesting is Muslims didn't understand that language at all, because most Muslim kids are from immigrant families. They are disconnected from the history of their homeland, and they can't integrate into the history of the host country. So in that sense, there's like a historical disconnect for them, right? And that's another problem that we have. And the last one is language. Language matters. And I've always said this, the way that language is used, the way that we use language to describe things. I said that the Quran was very specific in the way it used language. And I specifically used the first word of the Quran, Iqra, as a very specific understanding of how language is used. And so the idea is that Allah in the Quran is very particular in his language construction. What I learned from that is that there's an expectation from us Muslim scholars to then be very careful in the way that we use language. There's a difference between saying the Hamidian regime and the Hamidian government. Regime has a negative connotation. Government has a more positive connotation. When you call like the president of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, a sultan, you're not only being negative in terms of the Turkish president, you're also saying that Islamic history was negative because being sultanic is being an absolutist. And any of us who studied Ottoman history know that actually the Sultan was under immense pressure and subjugation because they had constitutional traditions in that sense. The sultans were not free to do whatever they want. In Muslim societies, the word sultan is seen as something which is positive, and in Western societies, the word sultan is pejorative. In that sense, language matters, but it's not only in terms of language in regards to how it's used negatively, it's also in terms of translation. There are some words which are translated, but they're translated incorrectly. So salah becomes prayer, and that doesn't catch the meaning. Now, in Islamicate languages, Marshall Hodgson created this word Islamicate, the idea that things that were influenced by Islam. So I give an example. When you come to Turkey, you see domes and minarets. There's nothing in the Quran and Sunnah that says we need domes and minarets. Nothing. But when we see domes and minarets, it resonates with an Islamic culture. We say, okay, that's what Muslims do. They have mosques with domes and minarets. So Hodgson called that the Islamicate, the idea that it's not Islamic, but it's Islamicate because it's influenced by Islam. What it also indicates is non-Muslims were influenced by Islam. So Jews and Christians, and in India, Hindus and so forth who lived under Islam, they were also being influenced by the Islamic culture. And so that's why there was a commonality, and that you could see Islam even in non-Muslims because they lived under it. Islam was osmosis to them in that sense, right? So the Islamicate languages, which are languages which Muslims use, even if words were translated, they sort of retained the same meaning. So in Turkish and Urdu use the word namaz. Namaz literally resonates with salah. The meaning is not lost here. So sometimes they took Islamic words and sometimes they indigenized the words that they had to an Islamic meaning. They became Islamized. So the argument I make is the Quran Islamized Arabic, and then the Quran Islamized other languages. And I always say to people, if you don't know Arabic, learn some other Islamic languages, because you can still take what I call the essence of Islam in those languages, irrespective of what they are. Now, English, French, and German, for example, these languages are considered as modern languages. The problem with modern languages is they were secular languages and they promote a form of a secular mindset. In that sense, they're not designed to facilitate for the Islamic, because Islam was never in the culture of the language. And so that's why there's a rupture in the language. And so then translation becomes tricky. I'm not saying translation isn't tricky in Islamic languages, it is. What I'm saying is trickier in what we call modern languages, which are the European languages in that sense. And so what happens is, sometimes when you translate words or ideas, you either literally translate or you derive meaning. Literal translation, things get lost in translation. If you derive meaning, that's ideological. You understand in that sense, right? So this is part of the challenge of translation. There are some words we translate, and then there are some words we deliberately don't translate. Khilafah, kuffar, jihad. We leave those messy. They're foreign, they're alien. And so what happens is when the young Muslim student is looking at the Islamic text and so forth, there's a nervousness because they can't understand their history. And these words are used in their history in that sense. So one of the things that we're trying to do is, in a controlled environment, like a Muslim academic themselves, they can help the student navigate this by explaining to them how the language operates. The disconnect from the language then is problematic. The hard thing is that Muslim students need to learn alternative languages as a way of opening their minds. So as I said, the three key things then are ideology, narrative, language. And these three things are very instrumental in the way that the young Muslim student and the young Muslim mind, and any Muslim mind in particular, is being shaped in the way that they do history. Me as an academic then, I'm aware of this. And so I'm trying to now deconstruct it to some degree. Okay, have I gone over time? Hopefully I haven't. Am I okay for time? I won't take up too much time.
Do carry on for a few more minutes, please.
Okay, cool. So as I said to you before, and the point I wanted to make, which is that what lessons can Muslims take from the Quran? Well, I've just highlighted to you how the Quran can be central to the way that the Muslim historian and Muslim thinker writes. In that sense, you don't have to take verses of the Quran out to be able to write history. You have to understand the ethos in which the Quran works and operates in that sense. One of the things that I always teach my students, the uniqueness of the miracle of the Quran, is the only miracle that's for the ears. Every other miracle was for the eyes to see. Every prophet came along and said, this is what happened. People saw it, they got amazed by it. But visual miracles are temporary, but linguistic miracles are timeless because you hear it all the time. And to understand the miracle, you then have to comprehend it. What's being said, what's going on. You have to think, you have to contemplate. The words in Arabic, ayat, we use the word ayat. Ayat, we translate as meaning verse, but they don't mean verse. They mean signs. Actually, the word is signs. And so every ayat is a sign from Allah for you to contemplate, to think what is being said, right? In that sense. So in that sense, what I'm saying is the Quran is a book which makes the reader contemplate. And so in that sense, the Muslim is expected to be rational in the way they think. They have a form of rationality and they must exercise that. And that's something that shouldn't be lost. What's also interesting is that there was a scholar in the Ottoman period. He said that Allah gave human beings two unique qualities to know of his existence. One was aql, which was reason, and the other one was his soul. The soul is yearning to know the need to worship. And so he argued that everybody worshipped. He didn't believe in people were atheists. He just said, people aren't atheists. They just don't know they worship something. We just need to know what they worship. Some people worship football teams. Go to a football team here in Turkey, you'll see collective worship. It's amazing. Some people worship pop stars. Some people worship money. Some people worship themselves because we live in a very narcissistic society. The form of worship is still there. But the idea of worship was that instinctual need to know that there was something greater than you. The other form was aql, to think, to contemplate, and to look at the world around you. And these two were part of the disposition of human. So the idea of what it means to be human is to understand those two. In that sense, Islam is asking you to think, be reflective. And in that sense, as a thinker and as a writer, there's not only an expectation for me to be right, there's an expectation for me to think, to be reflective, and for me to be emotionally sensitive. I give an example. I was in a conference once, and there was an academic from Israel, and we were sitting in the same conference, and he said, you know, one of the amazing things is that we're lucky that the people we're writing about, they've passed away. So we can get away with liberties if we get it wrong. And I got frustrated with that. I said, no, I disagree with that. Because people are dead, there's far more pressure on having the integrity of getting it right, because they can't defend themselves anymore. And as a Muslim, what will I say to Allah when this person on the day of judgment will say, you know what, that wasn't true? That's why the scholars would then write, and Allah knows best, as a way of safeguarding themselves from this caveat, because you're writing about people who can't defend themselves. And so you're given the best of your ability, but you have to have that level of humility. And so as an intellectual, I think as a Muslim intellectual, I think that's important. As I said before, Muslim scholars in the past have, Ibn Khaldun in particular, who was a genius in many ways. He said, for Muslims to be able to understand their future, they need people to write about their past. And he would write history for people in the future, because books were timeless in his mind. So we have to take that into consideration, that when we're writing, we're not only writing about today. So the idea of ummah, for example, ummah is not only about the feeling of ummah in the world you live in today, or Palestine, or the Rohingya, or China, or so forth. Ummah is the idea that there was an ummah before you. You are connected to a corpus of people who have existed for centuries that you are part of. You can't maneuver out of that framework. You are part of it. But not only that, there's an expectation that the hadith of Rasulullah, when he says, ummati, ummati, and the people ask him, which ummah are you talking about? He goes, the one that haven't come yet, for they won't have me. The idea that you have to have a vision for people in the future. You have to have not only a responsibility of the people of the now, you have to have a responsibility of your children and your children's children and people in the future, in that sense, right? You know, it's intriguing when I look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I always tell my students, you know, the Crusaders had a cross on Aqsa for 100 years. This is not the first time this has happened in Islamic history. The assumption in a nation state is the nation state is going to be here forever. And this is not true. Nations come, nations go. And this will also pass in that sense. And that's important to draw from that the Ummah need to have that sense of hope that it happened in the past. And don't worry, in the future, things will be better, because Muslims have to be hopeful. And the last point, I am disappointed in the failure of the traditional seminaries. The traditional seminaries have abandoned the learning of history. And in that sense, the sort of like intellectual component has been left within the Western academic framework. And to some degree, it then requires the young Muslim student to have the nous and the ability to navigate that space with all the pitfalls, which is very difficult. And to some degree, it's very hard for them. And the seminaries, to some degree, when they teach history, I feel disappointed, because they only write from the perspective often written from Western academia, which is strange for me. And so there has to be a way where the people in the seminaries are now turning to Muslims in the Western academic space where we can work together. I accept the fact that we are not a homogeneous bloc and there's a long way to go. But I honestly believe that it's necessary now in the seminaries to start teaching Islamic history, so that Muslims, we need intellectuals in Muslim societies in that sense. And so my concluding remark, what I want you guys to think about, and I hope I haven't spoken down at any of you in that sense, because I'm all ears. I always make this case that I want this to be a reciprocal relationship. As a young Muslim myself, who's a teacher who continuously teaches and so forth, I think it's imperative for me to continuously listen to the community in terms of what their thoughts, ideas are, people who've had experiences. Not only that, we can work together to try to help the next generation. So I want to know how we can change the current situation. I want us to think about alternative mediums. Social media is here to stay. I accept that fact. Social media, to some degree, and the internet has democratized knowledge to some degree, but there are pitfalls in social media. It's very restrictive. Twitter is toxic. Instagram, is problematic. And now the tools that people are going into, they're learning knowledge in a very reduced manner. How can we use those tools, but at the same time create alternative spaces? Some people argue that the university circuit is a 19th century institution struggling in the 21st century? Are there other ways that we can decentralize knowledge and create new forms of learning where we can support and so forth? And do we need more qualified historians and so forth? And how do we go forward from here? So I just wanted to present this as a framework. And then in the coming weeks, I'll give you a more detailed understanding of Ottoman studies and what I do as an Ottoman historian. But I guess what I wanted to do, and when Naeem asked me about this, or whenever I present on this, is I wanted you guys to understand some of the challenges and dilemmas and conflicts that I have had as a Muslim historian going through this. And I'm thinking out loud here as a way of maybe trying to get some assistance and support and help, as a way of saying, maybe you disagree with me, and that's fine, you know, and if you disagree with me, I'm all ears in that sense of how we can go forward. I wrote the article at Yaqeen Institute, and I wrote that for a Muslim audience, and I remember meeting Muslim academics who were surprised that I wrote it, because many of my colleagues were saying, you know what, this is a mistake, don't write this in this way. But I still felt, no, I'm going to put it out there. And then it was successful amongst young people. So the key is, and then the second thing is I did a talk on how to decolonize the Islamic history. And once again, it's similar ideas. So I'm going to leave it there. And thank you very much for being patient with me and listening to some of my thoughts and ideas about how to be an Islamic historian. And I'm all ears for the Q&A. Thank you.